That's funny.
Wonderful. So we are back with another teaching today. My name is Dawn of the New Era. And today we have
Okay, me.
you.
Okay, so my name is Susan Josephson. I've got a PhD in philosophy. I'm a retired philosophy professor and shaman. And this podcast is about YouTube video, whatever it is. It's about astrology from the perspective of someone who does divination. So last time we talked about the age of Aquarius. And so if you're interested in that, go to our last podcast. In traditional astrology, there are several kinds. Mundane astrology, which means the world pertaining to society as the whole, and made predictions about the weather, harvests, epidemics, politics, and war. And that's the most ancient approach. That was the approach then from the Babylonians, maybe 5,000 years ago, from whom we get the astrology traditions. Natal is concerned with character and the destiny of an individual. And that's more typically what people do in contemporary times when they do their horoscope and so on. Horary, 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 I have no idea if I'm pronouncing it right. That's about answering a question. And so the chart is cast from when the question is asked. And so, who should I marry, Joe? That might be the kind of thing that somebody might ask. And then what's called elections, which determines the best time for an action or enterprise. And that's something that's people used to use a lot. I imagine people still do, so should I take this trip now, and then you consult the stars. The most ancient use of astrology and where this all comes from is the calendar function. That is, the sky map tells us when we are in the seasons, months, years. We've got this yearly cycle, and within the month, the moon changes, as it goes through the month. And so this then can help us lay out a calendar. And the original calendars were lunar calendars. They used the moon as it goes through its cycles to then map out the months, and then so many months what you can see that all of the sky changes on a yearly basis, and then you're back to the beginning of the year. And that would then be done with respect to the moon and then the stars in the background, and how the stars in the background then change over time. And so moon cycles, sun cycles, the sun also rises and sets differently according to the season. And this then maps out time. So the sky, it was really important for telling us when we are. And we would still use the sky that way if we didn't have electronics and calendars already set. I mean, we would be able to look at the sky and say, okay, look, this is the way the sky looks. This must be this time of year. And this is the kind of thing that we get then in like the almanacs, where the farmer's almanac, certain times of the year, the times to harvest, sometimes to put the seeds in the ground and so on. This is the kind of thing that astrology starts with, is they start with these predictions about the seasons, about the calendar, and then from there it seemed obvious, given how important the sun and moon are for determining time, that then also determines human events. And so but however, the uh, the in the first few thousand years, the main way to use astrology, I should say, was what they call mundane astrology. That is astrology about the whole society, not for individuals. Their idea was the stars out there, and so they were using the background constellations that slowly move, and then the foreground five planets that are visible to the naked eye, and the sun and the moon, and how they move in relationship to each other, and how they move according to the background stars. And so for the ancient people, then the the stars were giving us messages about society as a whole. The predictions of weather were for everybody, and so why wouldn't the sky also be predicting for everybody? It wasn't like it is now, where an individual says, hey, what's my horoscope, and looks at the sky for themselves as individuals. In the ancient world, the sky didn't care about you unless you were a king, unless you were a ruler, then the sky cared. But otherwise, it was mapping out something for the whole society.
That's actually become popular again. Like there's a big wave of a concern in the astrology world around the Pluto return of the United States. So like I think there's still that looking at there is the individual, but there is a movement towards the mundane astrology or the collective astrology too.
Oh, that's interesting, because at the end of this, I'm going to advocate that we do that again.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's happening.
Good. That's great. So one of the interesting things, again, just looking at it from the history of astrology, is that for the ancient Semitic people, so these are the pre-Jews, the culture, maybe 1,000 years before Christ, the Semitic people before they became Jews, but then start in our own centuries, in our recorded history. For them, the moon was dominant, and for them, the idea was that the moon is there during the day and at night,
Mhm.
and it's the phases of the moon that help us map out time. So when it says in the Old Testament something about how, first there was the night and then God made light, they're thinking of the moon deity. They had a sun deity, a moon deity, and then the star Venus had a deity, and that's for their culture how they thought of the divine forces in the sky. But the moon was dominant, not the sun, because the sun, you can only see that in the day, but the moon, you see it at night and in the day. I mean, that's pretty cool.
That's very
And so
cool.
it's kind of interesting, because we tend to think of it the other way around. We kind of, a lot of cultures, many more cultures, thought of the sun, oh, the powerful sun, and kind of focused on the sun. So the most ancient astrology, then, from Mesopotamia, saw the skies as showing human affairs on the level of the kingdom or tribe. And and as I said, it was only really about the group, and the king, as the king represents the group. It was about your fate. And we had a podcast some time ago where we talked about fate. They were really, really interested in fate, because what the stars give you is your fate.
Mhm.
And that's not, I mean, that's not anything you want to go against. So the idea is that the uh, the stars show you what the divine forces want to happen. They tell us this is, as through the voice of the astrologers, they tell us about the divine will, and this
Tell
is
all
what
my clients to get their blueprint for life. I don't do astrology myself. I know It's very complex. Now you're making it more complex, which I love, all the different aspects of it. But I'm
Yeah,
like, hey, when you were born, there's a blueprint of your life. Because now it's like everybody's trying to rise into even though we're not all kings and queens,
yeah,
we all have our own sovereignty, that and the stars have a roadmap to our,
yeah.
like you said, our fate.
Yeah, yeah, the fate, and then and you have to, and so in the past, they would go with that, would go with the fate. Indeed, there are some very funny stories in the classical world. So the Greeks and the Romans were really into astrology, and of course, the thing is that their charts of the rulers, the Caesars, right, in the Roman times, for example, were public, so everybody pretty much knew, and they had perfected astrology to such a degree that they could predict a person's death. And so they would say, okay, blah, blah, blah was in the sky, such and such, and they could predict the death from that. They also, however, didn't just use, in the ancient world, they didn't just use the fixed stars and then how the sun and the moon and the five planets work against the fixed sky and the constellations and so on. They also used the weather.
Hmm.
So it was very specific to your location, which is one thing that we've lost over time. So the where you were born was just as important as when you were born in order to figure out your chart, because
Yes.
there are only certain things in the sky at that moment. It can't be generic. So now we tend to say, hey man, like me, I'm a Leo, this and such is true about me. From the perspective of these ancient people, nah, all Leo wouldn't make any sense to them. So what was the sun doing? What was the moon doing? What were the five planets doing? What was the weather like? I mean,
It's more detail, it's more specific. Leo is so general. I mean, we know how many, my mom's a Leo. You guys are totally different. I mean, you're both very kind, but you're a lot different personality. You can't go by that.
exactly, exactly. And we'll talk about how that came into being, how astrology in the West changed that way. But anyway, I just want to tell the story. So um, in the ancient world, these things were public. And so there was this one Caesar. This was in the time where the late in the Roman Empire, where the Caesars didn't tend to last more than a couple of years. They got assassinated and so on. But so the Tsar said that he was going to get a violent death on a certain date. And this is a advantage of astrology over other ways to do divining, that it can give you specific dates because of the way in which the thing is, and other things can't really do that. And so they said, okay, well, on a specific date, he was going to meet a violent end. So he figured, well, look, the people who had violent ends before him were all murdered by their bodyguards, basically, the Praetorian guards. So he didn't have any bodyguards because, they're murderous. And on the day when it was predicted that he was supposed to die, he locked himself in his room and he didn't let anybody in. And then it was evening. He figured the time had passed. It hadn't happened. He opened his door. He had somebody bring in the supper. Then they killed him.
Oh,
And
oh.
the idea is, and I have another example of that further down, but the idea is that the stars give you the divine will. And if the stars say it's going to happen and you do it, you're just implementing the divine will. He was supposed to die on that day. It wasn't really up to him whether he died or didn't die. As a consequence, in the European history, one of the things that they did later on with the kings in Europe was to forbid astrologers from working up the charts for the rulers, because if somebody knows that this guy is supposed to die on this day, they might decide to implement it.
Yeah. The whole astrology death thing, it's like we don't need I mean, honestly, what all the astrologers are saying is that America is going to die this year, which is
Right.
happening. Like I said, mail isn't showing up, buses aren't showing up, like
Coming apart.
societies are crumbling, but like no one wants to know the details, and especially a personal life. Like, no, let's not read that part
Let's
of what we're
let's
gonna
not
die.
exactly, exactly. And so basically astrology was about fate and um it it wasn't their only way of telling the future. I mean, people were also doing the entrails of sheep, and they were reading, they were doing oracles, like the Greek world to Apollo would do oracles. I mean, they had a lot of different sources. They really believed in future in fortune telling.
Mhm.
In the Middle Ages, Christianity destroyed all the ancient traditions. Their idea, and they burned the libraries and everything, their idea was if it wasn't in the Bible, they didn't need to know it.
Because they didn't want people to be empowered,
No, and they didn't want, exactly, didn't want people to be
informed.
empowered. And so, including classical astrology. And so the Christians were ambivalent about astrology because in their own history, in their own story, astrology has a part because the magi who come when Christ is born, they are following a star, and magi apparently in the original language where that word comes from means astrologer. So the
Oh.
astrologers had done a chart and had figured out that there was going to be this king of the Jews, which is what he was supposed to be, because at that point he wasn't Christ. That happens later. It predicted that the king of the Jews would be born at a certain place at a certain time. And so it was the astrologers that came. So in that sense, the Christianity had a stake in astrology, but yet they thought that if you're an astrologer, you're going to be worshiping deities, you're going to be an idolater, you're going to be worshiping the stars, because in the past the stars were thought of as divine forces and identified with deities. So some popes thought it was cool, and other popes went around murdering all the astrologers.
Oh my gosh.
you know. And for example, Saint Augustine, who is a famous uh, uh, philosopher, a famous Christian philosopher, he thought that if astrology works, it's only because the astrologers call on demons
Oh,
to make it
come
work.
on.
Exactly. I mean, that's what I say to, oh, come on, come
Oh
on.
my gosh. So
So
disempowered, man. Okay.
power tripping, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we got to have the power. We don't want anybody else to have the power, like that. But in the Renaissance, then there was a rebirth of classical wisdom. They got it back. It had been wiped out in the East, in the East, but in the European countries, but it was still being remembered in the Middle East. And so in the Renaissance, people got contact with the Middle East again, and so they then got the manuscripts of the Greek philosophers and the astrologers. And so there was a rebirth of astrology. And they were really into astrology. They did magic using astrology. They did medicine using astrology. If you look at the classical paintings in the Renaissance, there's lots and lots of astrology in it. Kepler, who's still part of that, 1571 to 1630, he's the last astronomer who's also an astrologer. And he had lots of famous predictions that he made. And one of the things, and so one of the things too was the thought that, for example, comets, meteors, eclipses were all considered herald omens, of misfortune for some people, but for other people, good fortune. For example, Alexander the Great had, when he was doing his conquering, he was in the classical Greek tradition, and they remembered when the eclipses were. I mean, the Greeks knew when there were going to be eclipses, and so he knew that there was going to be an eclipse, and so he told his soldiers, there's going to be an eclipse, and that means the other side's going to lose. Whereas their astrologers, were predicting an eclipse and saw that as doom, but
Interesting.
Aristotle, Alexander the Great flipped it. 'Cause somebody's doom might be somebody's good fortune, right? So
That's
he
true.
he flipped it. And so comets, meteor eclipses were generally considered heralds, dooms, omens of misfortune. For example, if a comet was first seen in Leo, it boded ill for monarchs. If in Virgo, for the harvest. The duration of an eclipse indicated how long its effects would last. For a lunar eclipse, the hours were converted to months. In the case of a solar eclipse, into years. And so this is there's a whole bunch of knowledge and wisdom and code for interpreting these things that had been worked out that has since been mostly forgotten. But however, a lot of astrology all through, as you go back, as long as there was writing, there will be a lot of astrologers who would point out that the stars are signs, not causes, that they require interpretation, that the astrologer needs divining skills. The chart gives the vision, and the astrology gives the general rules for interpretation, but it's the individual astrologer that interprets for this particular case. So you still need to be intuitive, inspired to do astrology. You can't get away with that, with not doing that.
You can't
And
just look at it scientifically. Every chart that I've ever had done, I notice when they go into the true voice and they start channeling, it's like it's almost like it gives it a kind of like our oracle cards or
yeah,
the ancient entrails of the
yeah,
sheep or the
yeah,
tea leaves, that it's like a tool,
yeah.
but you have to be intuitive. And all my best astrologer friends I know, they channel with it.
That's it. And they knew that in the past. However, in contemporary times, most people have forgotten that. And the science, then I saw this video where they were putting down astrology and they were saying, man, these stupid astrologers, they think that the stars are causing this stuff and the stars are really far away. They can't possibly be causing this. I'm saying, well, man, they didn't think it was causing this stuff. I mean, that's just you guys,
Yeah.
doing that. And so now in contemporary, I want to make the point that there are a lot of places in the world that, like in the Western world, there are a lot of people who think of astrology as superstition. But there are a lot of places in contemporary world where they are still actively using astrology in its complex form.
Good.
And so, for example, in contemporary India, they still use this complex form of astrology where they're really actually looking at it, the chart, in terms of, where, what the sky was doing at that particular location at that particular time, type of thing. I mean,
It's
exactly,
what planets are in what of the 12 houses, and then how the
exactly,
planets mirror each other. There's conjunct, there's like
exactly.
I'm getting ready to go through my every person goes through their Uranus it's a conjunction or something, and
Yeah,
it's basically the midlife crisis, and it's every single person gets a chance when the planet Uranus in your
yeah,
chart
yeah,
gets conjunct. It's when your kundalini rises, which I think is fascinating. Astrology
yeah,
is
yeah,
fascinating. We're so connected to the
yeah.
planets, but they're not doing it. I think what you're saying is they're symbols of, or blueprint or a map of just what is before we come here. We're like, oh, we need a map. And
Yeah,
there it's like looking at it, but the map isn't the actual road. It's not the actual
right.
mountain.
Right,
The
exactly.
map.
It's just a map.
It's representing it. Yeah.
Exactly. It isn't it, it's representing it. Exactly, exactly. And so and as we said, it really requires somebody, as we were just talking, who can as you say, who can do the true speaking, who can actually have the intuitive grasp of it. Otherwise, they're not very good at it. Basically, it requires intuition and sensitivity in order to do it. And the way in which the constellations are thought of in the West are not shared by the rest of the world. Other societies, other cultures have different ways of looking at it. So it's really a code. It's a cultural code as opposed to what's actually like, causing something in the sky. It's like you look at the sky, you see something, just as you see something when you do cards. It's
Yeah.
something that stimulates a vision in the astrologer.
I don't do math, but as you're talking, I'm like, it's like a mathematical formula.
Oh yeah, yeah. I can't do astrology either. I mean, I haven't got that kind of brain. I can't. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
you and I do the fortune telling, but we use different techniques to do it.
Yes.
But what I'm trying to say is this is another technique of fortune telling, and it has the same constraints. If you're intuitive and able to put yourself away in the right way and look, then it gives you the tools to do that. But you need that, otherwise you're going to screw up and
That would make sense because I've had both. Like I said, I'm fascinated with all this stuff. So the first time I got my chart done, he had a very scientific mind that Mars always means this when it's in the second house or whatever. But there's so much interpretation. Again, I've seen these women like click into the truth voice there's quite a difference. But I probably have my chart read 8 times, and each time someone has
yeah.
a different interpretation. Now there's such thing called astrotography too. Have you heard of that?
I don't think so.
It's where it's using the planets to find out the best place where your human self should be. So like
Oh yeah,
my
yeah. That was one of these. This was the one of these kinds. This was the it's called elections,
the
determining the
election.
best time for an action or enterprise. So that tells you where you should be when, should you take this trip? Are you would ask the question, and then they would look at the situation where you are right now, as opposed to something general in the classical,
Cool.
in the
Very
classical.
cool.
So basically, then, um, now another big difference between the way in which we look at the sky and the way in which people in the past looked at the sky is that, and it might be, I'll hear what your response is. Maybe there are people now who are starting to do that again, but is to see the sky as an expression of the divine will and connected to deities. In the past, astronomers were reading the fate of nations and peoples in the sky, and that this fate was divinely fixed. And so it was important that we follow what the sky tells us to do. The sky was sacred, it guided us, and we should do our best to follow it, obey it. The human spirit should use their knowledge of the sky to put their lives in harmony with the divine forces as seen in the sky. And a really interesting and uh, funny example of this is like the emperor, the Caesar Nero in the Roman times, and everybody, I'm sure, has heard of Nero fiddling while Rome burns, right? Well, what that was about was his he was a crazy guy, and it had said in his chart that he was going to be this crazy guy, and they did everything to kind of cool him out. But then he got a new astrologer, see, astrologer that was going to let him do whatever he wanted to do. And the astrologer told him that, well, when there was, they predicted this comet, and the comet predicted doom of a certain sort, that a great man would have misfortune, and Nero would have to take the hit because he was the Caesar at the time. And so his astrologer said, no, no, see, if you murder a bunch of other great men, they'd take the hit and you wouldn't have to.
Oh my
So he could
gosh.
just follow the divine wind by murdering somebody else, and which Nero did over and over. He murdered most of the royal family by deflecting blame, and then he got, and the one about the fire was that apparently the the bad news had to do with planet that had to do with fire, that had something to do with fire. And so Nero decided, well, okay, he'll just have to burn Rome. So he wouldn't personally have to take the hit. So that was the idea, that Nero is fiddling while Rome burns, because he's keeping the hit from fate getting him personally by deflecting it. And what's, I mean, which is insane and ridiculous, but interesting, because what it shows is how deeply they believed that it isn't, you don't have any free will. And that's part of what the Christians didn't like about the ancient astrology, because the ancient astrologers believed that if it was written, it was written, and that was what was going to happen. And what you needed to do was to be in harmony with the sky. And then if there's a hit that needs to be taken, you, as the emperor or whatever, you needed to take that hit, unless your people took the hit, and that wouldn't be moral. So you had to, you had to find some way around, but Nero took it the other way, right?
Hmm.
So in contemporary astrology, the sky as divine conflicted with Christianity. The Christians, and I find this interesting when it occurred to me, preparing this talk, is that unlike the Druids, for example, who, when they wanted to worship, they went out into the forest. The Christians, when they want to worship, they go inside a building.
Yeah.
They don't go into nature. They have sacred places. All the sacred places, as far as I know, are human places. They're graves or they're churches.
Yeah.
They're not outside. They're cut off from the sacred in the sky. And they thought of so the Christianity didn't see the natural world as sacred. And we still have that problem today, in terms of the Native Americans have sacred places. From the Christian perspective, which the majority is still probably the majority religion, they can't understand that at all. How can a piece of property, a piece of land, be sacred? There's nothing. If you go in a church, you got sacred, but you don't have any sacred in the landscape, you
Or
know?
in an animal, or in a star, or in a plant.
That's right. Isn't that
Yeah, it's like
something?
we're better, we're separate than nature, which makes no sense because we come from the ground, we return to the ground, but there, even that's been askewed. It's like, no, 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 we don't want to be a part of the earth and the animals and the nature.
Isn't that strange?
How skewed of a
Yeah,
perception is that?
I know. That's really strange, and that's one of the reasons that the Christianity finally broke with astrology, because astrology insists on seeing the sky as sacred, you know. And although there are now contemporary astrologers who don't do that, if we want to go back to astrology as it was, so to speak, to reconnect with its roots, so to speak, we have to remember the sky as sacred, the sacred in the sky, and see the divine winds, the will, in the sky.
Yeah, I would say much like I much like I've talked about the teachings of Mary Magdalene and Yeshua just got crushed by Christianity. And they're like, no, I mean, they were not saying that there's a man in the sky who is angry. God is angry and he's going to hurt you because you're a bad person. The true teachings of your innocence, you're pure, you are an animal and a spirit, and it's perfectly imperfect. Like all these teachings that got lost and pushed away by the church,
Yeah.
astrology, and and other ones, I believe they lived on through our cells. So the generation that knew, those Druids, all the indigenous cultures that knew, yes, maybe eventually the generations didn't have that access to the information, but
Yeah.
much like your mother was able, we talked about the last podcast
Yeah.
to retrieve this collective this intelligence
Yeah.
from somewhere. I don't know if it's ourselves or the consciousness. That's also happening in astrology. I mean, I every astrologer I know is, except for that first person I saw who really looked at it like every Mars means this, every first planet.
Yeah.
I mean, I know at least a dozen, and that's how many astrologers I know, and
Yeah.
they all do it from a place of each Mars is the sacred warrior, Venus is connected
Yeah.
to Venus,
Yeah.
the goddess. And so I
Yeah.
think I think maybe the last generation it maybe is what you're talking about, where it was
Yeah.
disconnected, but this new generation, they're retrieving that ancient
Yeah, yeah,
way. It is.
that's so good. That's so good. I mean, again, I mean, I think if we're gonna, if astrology is going to continue, it really needs to reconnect with the sacred. And I would suggest too, then to do it all the way, right? And so to do the sacred, do the readings in a sacred space and that kind of thing might make that even more powerful. It's like, and as we talked, for people to get reactivated in terms of seeing the sky. We don't see the sky. We don't interact with the sky. Most of us don't. I mean, we have lights inside our houses. We stay home or we drive around in our cars, or if we're walking, it's in the city and there are street lights. In our Western culture, and again, this is not true in all the cultures, but in our Western culture, we have very little opportunity to actually see the stars in their
And when
good
we
in their
do,
glory.
people are hooked on their phone. We have a big problem. I'm just going to get on the soapbox for 2 seconds.
Totally, please do.
With We're all awakening, right? Back to this
Yeah,
ancient cosmic intelligence. It's happening. It's the age of Aquarius, and it's like bing, bing, bing. Little things are being awoken in us,
yeah, yeah,
but yet our opioid brain is hooked to social media and our phones. So even pulling away for 5 minutes to
yeah,
stargaze. One of the coolest things that's coming up in my readings with clients that
yeah,
I don't know. I learned so much. I'm like, what? Like these star beings will come in, these frequencies or intelligence from the stars, and they'll say, she needs to go under the Sirius star system and just look, and we will teach her, or
yeah,
she
yeah,
will absorb the energy.
yeah.
And I know, especially the moon is such a
The moon, exactly.
deity
And that's why I talked about the moon at first. The moon is so
power.
powerful, so powerful.
And I know when you look at it, when you feel, when women who are disconnected and not looking at the moon, their cycles,
That's right.
their periods and their cycles are messed up. And I know when I get a chance to just look and say, hi, grandmother moon, that's what my friend Maggie used to call, hi,
Yeah,
grandmother moon. It's almost as if our bodies, then she synchronizes the waters of our body the way she does the ocean.
absolutely. Absolutely. We can feel the tug of it. I mean, it's got a gravitational pull, not just on a spiritual level, it's physical. I mean, and that's, of course, one of the things that's happened is that we've disassociated astrology from astronomy and and emphasize this idea that uh, everything is physical. It's all about physical causes. There's no spirituality. I mean, the and for example, there's still places, and I don't know if it's true in Ohio. I know as you go back in time, it's been true where doing fortune telling is illegal.
Illegal?
Yeah,
Oh my gosh. Probably an
yeah,
Amish country or something.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that my memory is, and I could be wrong about that, but my memory is that there was a time around here where you had to have a license to do it, and if you go back in time, it was illegal to do it. It's all superstition. You're just defrauding the customer. It's not possible to do it,
Right.
and if you do it, it's with demons.
We're still being made fun of. I mean, if you go on the phone and you put in psychic, you can put in, I call them gifts, but I think it's called something else. And it's where you can get little pictures that come up, and they've got like this eyes, or, oh, I'm looking in a crystal. Every tribe had a medicine woman or man. Every tribe had a seer, just like you had
Absolutely.
your hunters and your cooks and your
Absolutely.
mothers. And that role has been, it's really, it's not revered. I don't want to say revered. It's not respected,
Not
which is,
respected. Exactly.
it's
It's not respected. And
hurtful.
it's thought of as superstition and low class, and educated people don't do that. I mean, that's one reason why I always want to point out that I've got a PhD, because man, I do this. And it ain't because I'm uneducated.
I
But yeah,
know you got that going on. I'm
yeah.
like, what do
I mean,
I'm
but it's
like,
just,
I know her. She thinks it's real.
yeah, yeah, because I think that's totally, that's one of the ways in which all this stuff has been put down. It's been put down as something that uneducated people believe in, because they don't really understand science. And science, this funny video that I told you about. No, they had a million ways to put down astrology, and when you went through all the ways, if you actually knew something about astrology, you would have to say, not really. That ain't that, no, 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 no. It was just that they were taking it from this hyper science thing,
One, so 1D, it's not, it's like 2D. We live in a 3D world, but you
That's right.
2D it. And when it comes down to one of the avenues I really want to point out, I think I briefly touched on, is
Yeah,
that at some point, and you would know the era, right? You talked about the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and then there was an era where, and I get a feeling it's around the King James, where he redid those
yeah,
scriptures, the Bible scriptures, and took out all of the Enoch, the aliens, the future
yeah,
lives. Mary Magdalene was actually a rich priestess. When they took all that out, it
absolutely.
was because no one, you can't have kings and queens in a druid or a earth-based society. Everyone's role is super important, and we're all empowered. And so in order to keep a monarchy and a hierarchy, we
That's right.
have to be disempowered. Well, we're very empowered if we know the future, if
Absolutely.
we read the map of the stars, right? So
Absolutely.
step back into
Indeed.
your power,
It,
people.
indeed, that was one of the reasons why they made it illegal in Europe, in the Enlightenment. So after the Renaissance, they made it illegal in Europe to do this, because then ordinary people would know what was going to happen, and that would, I don't know,
And we be
and it might
connected to
be
the earth, and we
revolution and
don't need a
stuff.
king or a god in the sky to tell us what to do, because we're like, wait, we're cosmic, and just like you. So
Yeah, 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 yeah. They didn't want to empower people. So so they've come up. So what comes down to us then from these times is that all fortune telling becomes superstition, including astrology. There is no fate, right? Although in the classical astrology, it was not about your character; it was about your fate.
mhm.
And psychological astrology was born, and that's in the 1700s. So people started doing horoscopes that treated all sun, moon, planetary positions in generic terms. And this is something that people should watch out for, because if you look it up in a newspaper on your iPhone or whatever, okay, your horoscope for today. That's that's generic. That's not you.
Cosmopolitan magazine,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh yeah,
That's not
million
you.
people with that. That's
Yeah.
the same message, and that also discredits the actual art.
Exactly. Exactly. That discredits it. Exactly. Exactly. And so they made the sun sign primary, using unlike previously, where the sun was only one planetary energy among seven. instead of the exact locations and movements of the stars and planets at birth telling people their fate, all that was important was their zodiac sign telling them about their character. And we talked about that in the beginning. And so, as you said, I mean, all Leos aren't the same, all Scorpios aren't the same, but yet if you look at the newspaper version of it, we're all the same. We're all the same.
Right.
So they so it becomes about your character, not about your fate. So, for example, the moon reflects the ego image of personal consciousness, Mercury, the principle embodied in the archetype of the trickster, Venus, the maiden in dreams, etc. And this, again, it's generic. It's not. You've got if
You can't
okay, we can.
isolate it. You can't
Yeah,
isolate
yeah,
Venus. Venus is in a relationship with all
exactly,
the other planets.
exactly,
Venus is in a relationship with the house that she's in.
exactly,
Yeah, it's a
exactly.
very
It's too
complex
simple.
art. For those who don't know much about astrology, that feel like it's just my sun sign, which is most of the population,
Right?
it is a very complex, intricate, like we're saying, we don't even know how to read these charts because it takes a long time, but I think it almost takes ancient knowledge too. I feel like the astrologers I know, this is not their first lifetime doing astrology,
Got
because it's these young people who are just popping in, and they're just, oh yeah, your Venus when you were born were here, but it was also in relationship with Mars, and then your Saturn's expanding your mental life, and then in your spiritual house, but you have to put all the pieces
Exactly,
together. It's so complex.
exactly. Hugely complicated. It's very complicated. And all of these things are moving and they're specific to a place in a time as
Right, you have to
opposed to
be born at a
generic.
certain place in time for those
Exactly.
planets to be there.
Exactly, exactly. So you can't just say, oh, well, oh, because you were born in, well, like me in July, Leo. No, I was born in July at a particular place at a particular time with all of this complexity.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And so, but looking at it that way, I mean, a horoscope, even with the complexities taken out, a horoscope can still be useful for people to aid them in self-discovery as a pattern of archetypes, but it's not the way it was traditionally done. It's a weak shadow of what it used to be. And so just to give an example of that, I read a book that did the chart, a contemporary astrology chart for Hitler,
Oh,
and
wow.
from his birth date. And according to the contemporary astrology, he's an earthy, genteel soul, ambitious with some crowd pleasing needs. Using Ptolemaic astrology, so that's the classical astrology, Hitler is a complete degenerate whose career will lead to wholesale carnage, piled up corpses, unscrupulous defeat, and a violent death. He is shown to have a violently hysterical nature and an erratic mind. That's classical astrology, who actually
Wow.
looks at the complexity of it rather than looking at the surface. It is hugely different.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Wait, have you ever had your complex chart done
No,
by,
and it wouldn't be possible because I know, I mean, like I say, I know the date
but
that
not the
my
time?
birth was registered in Tübingen, but I was born in Germany during the war, right at the end of the war. I don't know that I was necessarily born in Tübingen. It may be that that was just where my birth was registered. I might have been born in this village that was some distance away. And I don't know what time I was born, you
Yeah.
know.
The
So
latitude, longitude, and the time.
exactly.
You got to have all the
You
little
gotta
details.
all the pieces. You gotta have all the pieces have to fit together. So I have no idea.
Okay. Well, I just had to try. I
So, like contemporary, as we said, contemporary people don't see the sky, and we're out of touch with the sky. So, for astrology to become fully meaningful again, we need to get in touch with the sky. We need to allow ourselves to feel the sacred with
Mm,
respect to the sky.
I
And
like that.
instead of going into houses to do our sacred, and as we were talking, we should do the trances sometimes outside, right?
Yeah.
We should do things outside, do commune with the energies of nature and commune with the sky. And as the classical astrologers also did, now, if you go back in time, it wasn't just the five visible planets plus the sun and moon and against the background of the fixed sky, so that would be the zodiac, but it was also the weather.
Interesting.
So it was, you feel all the atmospheric tradition, all conditions. You're not isolated from what's happening right here now. And in many cultures, when the baby was born, in these astrology, where astrology was strong, they would show the child to the sky after he was born.
Ooh,
Isn't
I
that
love that.
beautiful?
I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah, isn't that gorgeous? And so then, as you say, you are part of the sky. You are emanating with the forces of the sky, you know. But we don't do any of that. Um,
Some people do. I'm telling you, there's a big old tribe of ancient people that are being reborn, and there's all these people from that are visiting now because of the age
yeah.
of Aquarius from stars. I mean, I do readings on someone, and I go, "It's okay. I won't tell anyone. You're not from here, are you?" They're just like incarnated human bodies, but like part of their psyche is like
Oh,
straight up from far. They're like, needed to come back to this planet, or I agreed to come back to this or to this dense planet to assist you guys during the change of ages. So
yeah.
it's moving and a shaking here. We're
Oh, yeah,
not.
yeah. Well, that's great. That's great because I think that's the way it has to be. We have to do moon bathing, right? I
Yes.
know you're going to do that with your groups. I hope you do. I hope you do. Moon bathing, sitting under the sky at night, and trying to
Mm,
feel once again the sacred wind, and doing the astrology in its complex form, you know. But when we do it, the astrology in the complex form, as we said, it- we're needing to see it as us as part of a group. That's how, because the stars aren't really about us as individuals. They're
I think
really
it's both.
about,
I digress. I think that because
okay,
it's such
yeah,
an important time,
yeah,
like I could have said, I'll just do hair, but the very first astrologist I said, he looked at my chart, the complex, all the
yeah,
planets.
yeah,
He
yeah.
goes, first half of your life, aesthetic beauty field, second half of your life, spiritual teacher. Now, if he wouldn't have said that at such an
No.
instrumental time, what my map was, I might have said, why do I think I could do this? Why am I doing
Oh,
this?
oh, absolutely. You're
What
right.
gives
You're
me the
right.
right?
That there,
Well, it's in
there's
the
a
stars.
there's a path. There's a path. Absolutely. You're
Yeah.
right. You're absolutely right. There's a path. And if we can see this path and then can follow this path, absolutely, absolutely. And indeed, that's how the people did it in the past. And indeed, some of the writings, people say exactly what you said, that they only path, they only knew that they could follow this path because the stars told them.
Yeah.
The stars.
I would just go back and do hair or,
Yeah,
get with, I want to live on a commune. And the stars are
yeah,
like, no.
yeah,
But I see what you're saying about using it. Because in the last one, we talked about, becoming instead of individualized, which is important to a certain degree. It's part of it. It's not this or that, it's
yeah.
both, but
Both.
bringing in the
I like
community,
that.
bringing in that,
I
the
like that.
path of the collective and the community,
That's right.
realizing that we're not supposed to just do this alone. Yes, we know our part, but what's the big picture
Yeah,
too?
that's right. That's right. Absolutely. And how are we part of this big picture? Not
Yes,
just us as individuals. How are we part of a big picture?
I
That's
like
right.
that.
And that and I mean, one of the things that I got out of, putting all this stuff together for this talk, because as we've just said, astrology is beyond me. I haven't got a mathematical brain. I can't do that. That's just not my path. I mean, I'm totally right-brained. I can't do that left brain stuff. Was the sky, the sky, you know, how amazing it is that we're moving. We don't know that we're moving because everything is moving with us, but that we're moving through the sky, and that there are these big cycles. We talked about this in the last podcast too. There are these huge, big 26,000 year cycles. There are these smaller cycles, that everything is moving and changing, and that we're just part of the sky, you know? I mean, so I feel like astrology celebrates that, but we also have to see it as a way of doing divining, and as a tool. And so the people who do the astrology, they have to also promote in themselves their intuitive nature, and allow themselves to approach it from a intuitive, sensitive perspective.
Yes. All right. Did you hear that, everyone? Balance your yin and your yang, your intuition, and the science that is astrology.
Totally, astrology. And then next time we'll talk about the ways to do divining, which have got the mediums and channeling and that kind of stuff. So we'll
Ooh.
talk about that next time. Okay.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your wisdom and sharing.